Hello, everybody. Before talking about our case and about the Ford assembly line, we would like to introduce ourselves to our group. We are Group E, and I am Wesley Sobbe, and right now I am following the Pre-Master International Business. And I would like to give Jelmer his turn.
Hello, my name is Jelmer, and I'm a third-year student of International Business. So yeah, now I'm giving the word to Carlijn.
Hi, I'm Carlijn. I'm also a third-year student, International Business. And now it's up to Wouter.
Hi, my name is Wouter, and I'm also a third-year student, International Business.
All right, so hello everybody. This is our case presentation. We're Group E, and today we're going to talk to you about Ford and the transaction cost theory. So first I'm going to tell you the content. First we're going to give you an introduction to the case, then the main strategic issues, the application of the transaction cost theory, what went wrong and what went right, and what did we learn. So first the introduction. So we chose Ford as our company. So on October 7th, 1913, Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line for mass production of an entire automobile. This innovation took the production of a car from 12 hours to 2 hours and 30 minutes. This was the first time ever that there was a mass production in this industry. So what this meant is that it opened a whole new world for large industry who only made products when they knew they had a customer. So in that time, so that was the way it worked at that time. You began producing a product when you already had a customer, and now you could produce thousands of products that at a much lower cost, which you could sell for less money. And yeah, that was the definition of mass production. But before installing the assembly line, Ford had to consider whether or not to contract with free agents of integrating production into its own, or integrating production into its own factory. So having contracts with free agents involve transaction costs like bargaining power, bargaining costs, policing and enforcement costs, and search and information costs. These were costs that had to be taken into consideration. However, Ford had a very innovative production process which didn't exist anywhere else in the world for automobiles. So considering this, they chose to internalize their production process. And we're going to explain this based on the transaction cost theory in the next slides.
Thank you, Jelmer. I will talk about the main strategic issues for the Ford. So the first issue is inefficient degree of productivity. Henry Ford wanted to be the largest auto manufacturer and therefore needed expanded market worldwide. However, it wasn't only able if Ford could increase productivity drastically. Ford was only producing around 3 cars each day back in 1903. This was, of course, far from mass production. Furthermore, Ford also suffered from costs associated with transaction between the customer and the production of the car. In order to increase the productivity, Ford needed to make drastic changes in the production process. However, in this case, Ford was the first mover, and therefore there were no other companies which had a faster or wanted similar projects which could increase this productivity so drastically. So in this case, there was no real possibility to outsource because there weren't really any other companies with the same issues. This brings me to the second issue, because internalization brings high risk and very high search cost. Could I please go to the next slide? Yes, thank you very much. So Ford should try to solve the following question. Will internally solving the problem lead to cost minimization? The assembly line projects come with very high searching cost, and no other company has tried to invest in such a project. Therefore, there's a little to be known about other companies and about all the uncertainties which could come up during the project. Moreover, the project is very unit specific, which means that it fails that the project, if it fails, the project will have very high sunk cost because this type of issue will not come, or this assembly line will not be profitable for any other company except for Ford. Therefore, it's bound to the issue of the assembly line being internal and not outsourceable. And now they have the question, will it prove to carry lower cost than through market transactions? So that brings me to the overall issue. Will internal productivity increasement produce lower transaction cost than additional revenue produced by the new assembly line? Even if Ford finds a way to increase the productivity, will this be of value when performed internally? Because there are little alternatives for Ford if they try to go something else than internal. However, this risk of failure and thus the sunken costs are very high. There's also a possibility for Ford to invest in other sectors besides production. For example, they could choose to customize possibilities for individual consumers. Moreover, it's very uncertain whether higher productivity will surely lead to higher sales and therefore additional revenue, because the project costs need to be covered by an increase in sales afterwards. For Ford, it is important to know whether fast production is therefore a core competency in contrast to communication or maybe individual customization. Now I want to give the word to Wesley.
Thank you, Wouter. I will tell something about applying the transaction cost theory to this case. But let's give a little recap on the theory. Pretty much the theory of transaction cost economics is dedicated to answering the question of where a transaction or a function should take place or is housed. And there are two options pretty much, and one of them is internally in the firm or outsourced on the market. There are three categories of transaction cost. One is search and information cost, the second is bargaining cost, and the third is policing and enforcement cost. So answering the question of why did Ford go internal, we have to talk about the bounded rationality and bounded reliability of transaction costs, and these are pretty much the answer to why transaction costs exist. Bounded rationality actually is about if a person can make the right decision or the best decision, and this is pretty much bounded in every situation because we don't have all the information about a certain case, for example. And bounded reliability, and this pretty much means that a human being is bounded in its reliability because we are now pretty much selfish in choosing between someone else or choosing ourselves. One of the reasons why Ford did go internal is Ford's product in the assembly line was the first assembly line for automobiles. And if Ford was going to outsource their assembly line to a supplier, it would create a bilateral monopoly. And what this means is that there is one supplier on the market and one potential buyer or consumer on the market. And it would create a bilateral monopoly where there's one supplier and one buyer. This would mean that the buyer has a pretty much hostages the supplier, because the supplier has to invest a lot of money in making that assembly line for Ford, and essentially couldn't get out of that contract. And this would create a lot of transaction costs because the supplier would know that they would become sort of a hostage of Ford, so would maybe ask for a part of the sales of Ford, for example, and this would mean there would be a lot of policing costs, bargaining costs, and it would be a long process in order to find the right supplier, knowing they would become hostage. So this would mean there were a lot of transaction costs beforehand. Then let's look at the transaction costs. Then let's look at the particular transaction cost. And these are three factors: asset specificity, uncertainty, and frequency. And pretty much making the car and putting in that assembly line is high asset specificity. It will be the first assembly line as an innovative product, which means there are few suppliers who are going to act opportunistically, and it requires a detailed contract with clear consequences. There would be a high certainty because it wasn't done before, which means that making that assembly line would mean that there is much uncertainty, many possible outcomes, and a high chance that contracts will need to be renegotiated, as I said before. And high frequency, the whole idea of Ford creating doing mass production was having a high frequency of cars, making sure the price of the cars were lower so that the normal citizen of America could afford a Ford car. And now I would like to give the word to Carlijn.
Okay, thank you. We'll start with the advice for managers who are in similar situations. One advice to give in general that's not particular to our case is when it's about transaction costs, managers should keep in mind that there are three different transaction costs. First, search and information cost. Second, bargaining cost. And third, policing and enforcement cost. In this case, this went right. Secondly, transaction costs are looking at the case. When looking at the case, is a very good indicator to choose to go internalize or outsource, and therefore every manager should look at these indicators before entering their and take them into account. For what went wrong and what went right, we start with what went wrong. The whole process was complex, and the beginning of an assembly line for cars was never been done before. Therefore, it was all new, and a lot of things had to be found out in order to be executed. This was something that took a lot of time. And because it was all new, a major amount of time was invested. And at that moment, this time could also be used in other places in the company, what would be at that time be more efficient. Lastly, this is a minor detail, but there are also some sunk costs. And sunk cost is a cost that has already been incurred and cannot be recovered. All of those three things that went wrong were not major, but things they could improve of. And lastly, what went right. At the end, the result of what was created, namely the assembly line for cars, this is something for Ford what was really important. It created mass production and thereby was the start of something for cars we use today still. Another good thing what they did right was to internalize. Through this, they had a new they had a new innovative product that was not necessary to outsource. Thereby, outsourcing will be too expensive. This option was safer to end with. And now, lastly, what we learned from the case. First of all, we learned the slightly easier things from the lecture. An example of this is when companies should outsource their activities and when companies should internalize their activities. Something we learned from the case is a simple explanation, and that is the lower the transaction costs are, the more efficient markets will be, and smaller the firms will be. And lastly, from the case, we also learned that most of the economic history can be explained using the same concepts, namely transaction cost explanation seems to explain almost everything. This was it for what we learned. And thereby this was our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And if there are any questions, you can put them in the comment box or ask them in the tutorial.